All right, we're going to get started on our thread saver pouch. Before you take the pattern piece off, remember you should have already transferred these two circle markings to the wrong side of your fabric with a marking pen. You only need to transfer it to one piece, not both, but make sure that you can see them because it will help later on. So before you take this off, make sure you've transferred those markings that are on the pattern. So now I can take this off. I'm going to put my pins in my pin cushion and put my pattern aside. Our instructions tell us to get started with this, we need to take these two pieces apart and put them right sides touching. So this is how it started out originally. You just take them apart, flip them around, and now the right sides or the pretty sides are touching. We're also going to pin them in place so they don't move while we're sewing, and you don't need a lot, so we're going to go down and then up so the pin lays nice and flat, and I only need really one on this edge. So now we're going to do one of the long edges. And I'm going to put about 2 on this edge, down and up. So on that side, let's do the other side. Down and up, and down and up. So now, this should look like what your instructions look like. We have some pins on the edges. We don't need to worry about this down here yet. We'll get to that in a minute. All right, our next step is to sew a 5/8 of an inch seam down this long edge, and this short edge without the markings. We're going to do something different down here, so do not sew the edge with the markings. I'm going to start on this long edge, and remember to sew a 5/8. You're going to find the 5/8 inch line marking on the stitch plate. You're going to place your fabric on that line. I'm going to lower the presser foot, twist the hand wheel so the needle goes in, and then kind of just tug your threads to the back so they don't get jumbled up. So here we go, we're going to do a 5/8. We're going to sew forward a couple of stitches, back stitch to the edge, and then go down until we get to our first pin. And remember, don't sew over the pin, so before you get to it, stop, take it out, put it in your pin cushion, and move on. Remember, when you get to the end, slow down a little bit, back stitch a couple of stitches, and then lift up the presser foot. Take it out. You should have nice straight 5/8 of an inch line. Before you move on, I would suggest that you trim your threads. Make a little pile to throw away for later. All right, now we're going to do the other edge, the other long edge on the 5/8 inch line. Remember to back stitch. Remember to back stitch at this end. And lift it up and then trim your threads. Okay, we're ready to sew our short edge from here to here at 5/8. And as you get to where your stitching line is, I forgot to say this earlier, because we're going to be clipping the corners on this, I want you to try to back stitch at the edge, but also back stitch a little bit farther to go over the straight stitch so that when we clip our corners, that corner is a little bit more reinforced. So as I go forward, I'm going to back stitch over the stitch line, but also back stitch at the edge so that when you take it out and we get ready to clip the corners, that stitch corner is reinforced. Make sure you do that on both of these corners. I just forgot to mention at the beginning. All right, so we're going to trim these threads. Then we're going to do the other end. Now the other end is a little bit different because we have these markings here. So when you do sew, make sure that you can see the markings. If you have them upside down, it's not going to really work and it kind of defeats the purpose. So make sure you can see the markings at this opposite end. The reason the markings are here are because we need to leave an opening between those markings. I want to sew from this edge to the marking and then from the marking to the other edge so that I have a little hole right here. So it's still the same thing, 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, but I'm going to stop at the first marking and back stitch there first. And again, just like this end, I want you to back stitch a little bit farther over this stitch line to reinforce that for when we clip it. So here we go, 5/8 of an inch. I'm going to start, back stitch, and when I get to that first line, back stitch again. And then as I'm getting closer to the dot, I'm going to stop and back stitch at the dot as well. So that when I take this out, you can see I have just a very short seam there, but I stopped right at the dot. So we're going to clip these threads. Now we've got one last little piece to sew here. This time I'm going to start at the dot, the marking, and go to the edge. So as I place this in here, I'm still following the 5/8 of an inch line, but I'm just going to start at the dot instead. So as I'm here, I'm going to put my needle in. I'm going to back stitch a little bit where I started, and then I'm going to go to the edge, and again back stitch a little bit over that stitch line, and then go to the edge and back stitch at the edge. And real quick, we're going to clip our threads. Now we have all of our edges sewn. Our next step is to serge. Okay, so now we are ready to actually serge our thread saver pouch. So when you sit down, make sure you're sitting down face on with the machine. You're going to place your thread pouch on the serger and make sure that your fabric always goes to the left, because if the knife is right here and you put your fabric over here, you're going to cut your bookmark or your thread pouch or your cord keeper, whatever it is, in half. So always keep your fabric to the left. When you first start, there is a red mark on the presser foot, right here on the presser foot. You need to line up the straight stitch that you did on your project with that red line. This is what you're going to follow as you serge all the way down. Don't worry about any of these other markings. Keep the red line on the stitch line. So make sure you start out nice and slow. You're going to keep a hold of your project at all times. Remember to keep your finger away from the knife, so keep your hand down here at the bottom. So we're going to just place the fabric under the foot, and those feed dogs are just going to grab it, so don't lift up the foot. So here we go, nice and slow. And as you go, keep the red line on the stitch line all the way down. As you get to the end, move your hand out of the way and continue to serge until you have that tail left over. You're going to bring your shears with you over to the serger, and you're going to clip the tail next to your fabric so that it leaves the tail behind on the machine. You will have another tail over here, so clip that off. And if you look at your project, the serging should never go over your straight stitch. You should have a little gap of fabric in between your straight stitch and your serging, and it should stay pretty straight. Again, if you need to practice, make sure that you practice on some scraps before you just put the pedal to the metal and go. So our instructions tell us that we need to serge both of the long edges and the short edge that we sewed all the way across. We are not going to serge this bottom edge right here. We need this open so that we can turn it pretty side out. And if we serge this edge, we're going to serge everything shut and we won't be able to turn it. So make sure you read your instructions carefully. You're only going to serge the 3 fully sewn edges. So I'm just going to turn my fabric. I'm going to line up the short edge, the stitch line with the red mark. Go nice and slow. Keep my finger away from the knife. And again, continue past until you have a little thread tail and cut it so the tail's left behind. Then we've got one more edge to serge. Right here, this long edge. Line it up with the mark and serge it straight. And now your thread saver pouch is fully serged and we're ready to move on to the next step. The next step on our thread saver pouch, before we can turn this inside out, is we need to reduce the bulk in all of these corners that we've sewn. When we turn this right side out, if all of this seam allowance is still in here, it's going to be bulky and get all messed up and kind of trapped in there. So a little trick in sewing is called clipping the corners, and this will help reduce the bulk so that it ends up more square. So the most important part is that you do not cut through the straight stitch, because if you do, you will have a hole in your project. Yes, you are going to cut through some of this serging and the seam allowance, but do not cut in this corner. So we're going to take our shears and we are going to cut diagonally across that corner. So yeah, we did cut through some of our serging, but if you look carefully, our straight stitch is still intact. So now when we turn this inside out, these two corners will come to a sharp point instead. So we're going to do that for all 4 corners down here. So I'm going to take my shears, get close to where the stitches touch, but do not cut through the straight corner stitch. Same thing on this end, and same thing on this end. So now all 4 corners have been clipped. Before you move on to the next step, you need to bring your grading sheet to your teacher with your project like this so that she can check off your serging and your stitch lines and your marking. So do not move on to the next step until your thread pouch has been graded at this stage. All right, the next step after your thread pouch has been graded at this stage is to turn it right side out. So this is kind of fun. We're actually going to use either the end of a pencil or one of these dowels from the supply cupboard, and we're going to push the sewn end out through this opening that we left between those 2 markings. So I'm going to take my thread pouch and I'm going to kind of open it up and kind of move this around. I'm going to take the dowel, or you can use a pencil, and kind of push this sewn end right through that opening where we left the markings. And now it is right side or pretty side out. But if you look at it, it's kind of like, well, that doesn't look very square or rectangular. So we're going to use another tool called a point turner to help push out these corners to make them nice and square. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to drop it in my thread pouch. And I'm going to very carefully use it to work the corners into a sharp point. Be careful that you don't poke too hard, or you will go through the fabric and then you'll have a hole in the corner. You can see how much more straight and square that corner is. So I'm going to do the same thing to this bottom corner. I'm going to use the point turner to carefully shape and poke out that corner. So now this end is done. I'm going to kind of turn it around inside here if I can. If not, I'm going to just flip it around and maybe take it out halfway and use it to do these bottom corners as well. So now we can see that this is a lot more straight, crisp, and professional looking than it was before. Our next step is to press this, so we'll go over to the iron and I'll teach you how to press this flat. Here we are at the iron. We're getting ready to press our thread pouch flat. If you'll notice, these two, all of the edges that we've sewn kind of like to roll and do their own thing. We want the seam line to be right on the edge. So the easiest way to do that is to roll it between your fingers as you're pressing. So I'm going to take this edge and I'm just going to roll the seam, roll the seam, roll the seam until that seam line is right on the edge. And then I'm going to press it in place. So we'll do the short end first. So I just rolled it and press it in place. Now we're going to do the long edge. So I'm going to roll this edge, and I use the iron to kind of hold it in place, and then I can roll as I iron all the way down that edge. Then I'm going to do this other edge the same way. I'm going to roll it to the edge and use the iron to flatten it out. Now this end, remember, has the opening in it, and some of this seam allowance, this fabric, might like to poke out. Make sure that you fold it inside the thread pouch so that it makes a nice straight edge. You don't want any of that seam allowance or that fabric poking out. You can also see there's our markings there. So we're going to press that flat first. And then depending on if you have the markings that disappear with heat or with water, these ones disappear with water. So I'm going to take my iron at this point and I'm going to use the spray function and I'm going to spray those to get them kind of wet. And then after I iron it again, those markings will disappear and I won't see them on my fabric. I don't need them anymore, so I'm going to erase them so they're not in my final project. So now, here's our thread saver pouch at this stage. It is perfectly flat and square. We're ready to move on to the next step. All right, the next step of our thread saver pouch is to sew this opening shut. So it tells us to top stitch at 1/4 of an inch. Top stitch means to stitch on the top or on the right side. So you can see right now we have 2 right sides. It does not matter which way you put it in. We do need to make sure we're following the 1/4 of an inch guideline though, which is the outside edge of our presser foot. And all we're going to do is sew from this corner to this corner in a straight line. So when I place this under the presser foot, I'm going to lower the foot so that the edge of the presser foot follows the edge of my fabric. I'm going to back stitch at the beginning and at the end and just do a straight line. So I'm going to start slow, back stitch to the edge. Remember to back stitch here at this edge. I'm going to lift up the presser foot and then we're going to trim our threads. Let's move on to the next step. All right, we're going to bring our thread pouch over to the iron. We've got this open edge sewn shut. The instructions tell us that next we're going to take this sewn edge and we're going to fold it up on top of itself about 3.5 inches from edge to edge. So it's really important at this stage that you use your seam gauge. We're going to slide the marker over until it reaches 3.5. And right now I'm just guessing, but I'm going to lay my seam gauge on top. I'm a little too tall, so now I know for sure that this is an accurate measurement all the way across. So 3.5 inches up, I'm going to press that in place. And I would recommend you use lots of steam on this folded edge to really make sure it stays in place and does not move around. The next step tells us to take the top. This is basically going to become the flap of your pouch, and we're going to fold it down on top of that folded edge, just like that. And we're going to press that in place using lots of steam. All right, so now once it cools down, we're going to open the flap. We're going to just kind of fold it out of the way, but you can see now it has this really nice crease in it. We're just going to leave it open, and the instructions tell us that we need to pin these 2 edges together now. So as you can see, this is going to make our little pouch here for our thread. So we're going to take the pin, and you really only need 1 or 2 per side. We're going to go through all layers of our thread pouch, down and then up. We'll do one more on this edge. Down and then up. We're going to do the same thing on this side. We're going to go down and then up, down and then up. So now we have the beginnings of our pouch. Make sure for the next step that you leave the flap up. We do not want to sew our pouch closed, so leave the flap up. We're going to go over to the sewing machine and finish sewing this next part. All right, the next step in our instructions tell us to top stitch around the edges of our pouch. Again, this is really important that you leave the flap of your pouch up during this part. We do not want to sew it shut. Another part of the instructions tell us that we're going to need to pivot at all of these corners. So on our machine, there's actually a cool function called the needle up down, and it's this button right here. When you first turn on the machine, you'll see a little indicator with a little needle looking symbol with an arrow pointing up. In order to pivot easily, we want the needle to stay down in the fabric while we pivot. So I'm just going to press this button 1 time, and then the needle will show that it will stay down. This will be helpful when we get to these corners and we're about to pivot. So the instructions also tell us that we need to start at the bottom corner so that we can go all the way up the edge, across the top, and down the other edge. Do not top stitch on the folded edge. You do not need to. It is shut, it is closed, we do not need to sew it again. So I'm going to start on my pouch on this side, and we're going to do 1/4 of an inch, which is the outside edge of the presser foot. So we're going to start at this bottom corner. We're going to back stitch at the edge. And remember, when we get to a pin, we stop, we take the pin out and go forward. And if you've noticed, the needle is now staying down in the fabric so that it won't move when we pivot. So I'm going to continue working my way up the edge. I'm going to slow down as I get to this corner because I'm going to go to about 1/4 of an inch away from the corner, and then I'm going to pivot and go across this edge. So if you're new to pivoting, go nice and slow, and we're going to guess about right here. when we lift up the presser foot, the needle is in the fabric, so it's not going anywhere, which makes it really easy to go and pivot to a new edge. But if you'll notice, the edge of my presser foot is no longer on the edge of my fabric. That means I did not go far enough in order to pivot. But no worries, all I got to do is lift the presser foot, pivot it back the other way, and continue on a couple of stitches. I'm going to stop right there, and we're going to test that out. So I'm going to lift that up, go forward, and look at that. Now the edge of my presser foot and my fabric are exactly where they need to be. If you do go too far, you can always backstitch, but it won't look as nice, so try to go nice and slow and stop where you need to. Test as many times. So now we're going to top stitch across the top of the flap. And again, we're going to go nice and slow until we get to this edge. I'm thinking maybe one more stitch, lift, pivot, lower the presser foot right on the edge, and then go down the other edge of the thread pouch. Make sure as you get to the top of your pouch that it lays nice and flat and it doesn't get folded over. And remember to backstitch at the end. Now your needle will stay down, so if you want to change that now that we're done pivoting, remember to turn your needle up-down function back to up. You can also use your hand wheel to lift the needle up. Just make sure you turn it towards you. So we're going to lift this up, and then we're going to trim our threads. Now we're ready for the next step. All right, we're getting ready to make the buttonhole for our thread pouch. You'll need a couple of supplies, so obviously you're going to need your pouch and the button you chose. You're also going to need a seam gauge and a marking pen. Now in your packet is the formula for measuring a buttonhole. The buttonhole formula is diameter plus depth. So when you take your button, diameter goes from side to side, and then depth is basically how tall it is or how deep it is. So I'm going to take my seam gauge and I'm going to lay it on top of my button, and I'm going to measure the diameter from side to side. This button is 5/8 of an inch in diameter. I'm going to leave the little slider marker where it is, but I'm going to move the button and I'm going to turn it sideways. And I'm going to add how deep it is. In this case, this is 1/8 of an inch deep. So all I need to do then is slide my seam gauge up 1/8 of an inch. That way I have a 3/4 inch because it was 5/8 plus 1/8 is 6/8, or the same thing as 3/4. So again, we're going to do that one more time. I'm going to take the button, we're going to measure the diameter, we're going to go from left to right, and then we're going to measure how tall or how deep it is and add that measurement of 1/8. So as we mark this on our thread pouch, you want to kind of eyeball where you would like your button to be on your pouch. And as you do this, you can do it from either side and kind of measure and look and see, oh, that looks good there in the middle or in the center. I would recommend that wherever you do it, try to do it below the stitch line that you have where your top stitching is. It just will look nicer that way. So I'm going to open this up and I'm going to just kind of eyeball. That looks centered to me. So now I'm going to move my button out of the way and I'm going to place my seam gauge right where my button was. I'm going to take my marking pen and I'm going to measure from the edge of the seam gauge to the slider over at 3/4 of an inch. So I'm just going to draw that line right there. Now another helpful thing to do to finish off this marking is to make a start mark and a stop mark. This will be helpful so that you know where to start and where to stop. And this becomes your buttonhole symbol in order to sew your buttonhole on your pouch. So now we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew that onto our flap. All right, so now we're ready to do the buttonhole. These machines luckily do automatic buttonholes. So as soon as you have it marked on your thread pouch, all you have to do is press a couple of buttons and switch the presser foot and you're ready to start. So on the front of your machine, we're going to find the buttonhole symbol, which is right here, number 11. All you need to do is press that button, and it will automatically tell you what step you need to be on your buttonhole. The other important thing that you need to remember is to switch your presser foot on your sewing machine. Your presser foot is in this little black bag that's inside the drawer next to your sewing machine. So you just unzip it and you find the buttonhole foot, which in this case is number 3. So printed on all of these presser feet is a number. Number 3 is the buttonhole foot. Number 1 is the regular foot. So the easiest way to switch these out, on the back of the presser foot lever, there is a little red button. You just press the button in, that presser foot falls off, and we're going to put it actually underneath the machine so that it doesn't get knocked off onto the floor in somebody's bin. So right when you take it off, put it under the machine, and then you can just move it out later. To put the new one on, you're going to slide it underneath the presser foot lever, and you're going to take the little lever here and you're going to drop it and click it into place. You'll know that it's where it should be if when you lower and raise the presser foot, it goes with it. If it just stays down on the stitch plate, you got to make sure you hook it in. So we're going to take the thread and we're going to thread it through that little crack right there, and now we're ready to go. So if you look at this presser foot, there are 3 prongs, 1, 2, 3. The middle prong is going to line up with your line that you marked for your buttonhole. So we're going to place this under, and we are going to start right here where those 2 lines intersect on our marking. So this middle prong of the presser foot follows this line all the way down. You're going to start here where the 2 lines touch, and you're going to end here where the 2 lines touch. So go nice and slow so that you don't go past the marking or you don't start too far above the marking. So here we go. I'm going to place this under, and I'm going to make sure this middle prong is lined up with the blue line, and I'm going to lower the presser foot, or the needle, using my hand wheel so that it starts right where those 2 lines touch. And if you look at the front of your machine, you'll see that this line is blinking. That means that's the edge of the buttonhole that it's going to sew right now. So we're going to get started. We're going to go nice and slow. These stitches are going to be really small and close together. That's what you want. So as we get started, you'll see that it's going to do a really tight zigzag all the way down the left-hand side of our marking. Don't push the fabric through. Don't try to pull it back towards you. Just let it do its thing. Your job is to guide it down that edge. So now we're going to stop because I got to that other blue line. We're going to press the back stitch button 1 time, and that will move it to the next step. So don't press it multiple times, otherwise you'll get mixed up in your steps. So in order to go to the next one, I'm going to press it 1 time, let go, and now the other line is blinking. It's going to go straight back up to the top of our buttonhole automatically. So I'm going to go nice and slow, and it's going to do a straight stitch, kind of right on top of that blue marking, but to the right of the zigzag. And as you get closer to the top, make sure you slow down so you don't go too far. To go to the next step, again, press the back stitch 1 time. This step is going to go back and forth in the same spot for a couple of times and then automatically do the zigzag down the other side. So as we get started, you can see that it did the little bar tack, and now it's going to do a zigzag all the way down the right hand side. The zigzag stitch will overlap the straight stitch, but don't let it overlap the other zigzag stitch. Stop when you get to the bottom and press the back stitch again 1 time. It's going to do the bar tack at the bottom, and then it will stop automatically on its own. That's when you know the buttonhole is finished. So it's going to do the bar tack, and then the machine is going to slow down, and then it stops. I'm still pressing on the foot pedal, but nothing's happening. That means that my buttonhole is finished. So I'm going to lift the presser foot, I'm going to take it out, and we're going to trim the threads. All right, so as you can see, we started where that vertical line is. We sewed all the way down to the other vertical line, but there's a gap in between these 2 zigzag stitches. That's where we're going to cut open in order to let our button get through. So in order to cut this open, you got to be very careful. You do not want to miss the mark on this spot and overcut and make a big mistake like that, because it will really take some doing to get it fixed up again. So the easiest thing to do and the most careful thing to do is to fold your buttonhole in half, just like this, and then take your shears and very carefully snip right between those 2 zigzags. Then you can open it up use your shears to very carefully cut to one end, and then turn it and cut to the other end. Again, try not to cut through any of the thread, either at the top, the bottom, or either side. But now, if you've done this correctly, your button will very easily slide through that opening. You don't want it to be too loose or the button will just kind of fall out, but you don't want to be so tight that you're trying to push that through. It should just kind of come through nice and easy. Okay, we're on the last step of our thread pouch. We're going to sew the button to our pouch so that we have a way to put our thread and our bobbin inside so it doesn't get tangled. So a couple things you're going to need, obviously your pouch, your button, you're going to need a toothpick, a hand needle, and some thread. This is the hand needle holder. You just take the top off, and you're going to twist it like a tube of glue or chapstick, and you'll see that all the needles come out. So you're just going to find one you like, twist it back together, and put the lid back on. Make sure you put your hand needle back in here when you are done. In order to sew this button on, a little hint that I would give you is to get a lot of thread, maybe 2 arms lengths, fold it in half, and then thread the needle. That way we're not spending a long time threading the button, going up, down, up, down, up, down a million times. This way it'll reinforce your stitching and it'll be faster. So I'm going to unroll my thread, and I'm going to get a couple arms lengths. Cut that right there. And then I'm going to fold it in half. So I'm going to take these 2 ends together. Hopefully I don't get a knot. So I'm going to fold this in half. Now I'm going to take, oh, there we go. I'm going to take the folded end, so the side that has the loop, and I'm going to thread it through the needle. And if you can't quite get this, we do have some needle threaders in the cupboard. So I'm going to thread the needle and I'm going to fold it in half again. So now, instead of just 2 threads, I have 4 threads all together. That will help sew the button on faster and also make it stronger. So now I'm going to cut this to make these ends even. And a little trick I learned to tie a knot quickly is you're going to wrap it around your finger until it makes an X. Put the thumb over the X, and then we're going to roll it off our finger, and then just start balling it up with our fingers, rolling it between our fingers, and then really quick, use your fingernails to pull the knot down to the bottom. That will give you a nice sturdy knot as we move on to the next step. So here we are ready. Now the most critical part of sewing on the button is that you want the button to be centered with your buttonhole. It does not make sense to sew your button clear down here because your buttonhole's way up here. So an easy way to make sure that it's centered is to fold the flap shut. You should have your buttonhole cut open at this point. So you're going to take the needle and you're going to stick it right through the pouch. Don't pull it all the way through, but stick it right through the pouch and the buttonhole right in the center. So now we can lift the flap up, pull our needle through, pull the rest of the thread through. But here's another tricky part. If we go all the way through the pouch to the back, we're going to sew it shut right there. So after you get it centered with your buttonhole, lift the pouch forward and kind of pull that pouch up, and then only pull the needle through the top of the pouch right here. So we are not going to sew through the front and the back together. We're only going to sew through this front pouch. So now this knot will show me exactly where the center of my button should be. So take your needle now and come from inside the pouch right up next to the knot. Don't go through the same hole or you'll just pull the thread out. Pull it all the way through, and then we're going to take our button and we're going to drop it on through one of the empty holes, and we're going to center it right over where that knot is. Now, if you have a button that has 4 holes, you can make X's or you can do straight lines. If you have a button with 2 holes, you're just going to go back and forth. I would make 2 complete X's if you have a button with 4 holes, or go back and forth 3 times with a button with 2 holes. So here we go. I'm going to go diagonally to make my first X here. And again, make sure you're only going through the flap of the pouch. Don't go through the front and the back. I'm going to pull the thread until I have a little loop left over. This is where your toothpick comes into play. You're going to slide the toothpick under that loop against the button and pull tight to hold it in place. The reason we're putting a toothpick here is so that we can leave space under the button for this flap to get around. If you sew the button really tightly against the fabric, there's no space for this extra layer of fabric to get around. So we're going to leave some space and make a little thread shank, and I'll show you how to do that as soon as our X's are done. So I'm going to come up from behind through one of the empty holes, if I can find it. There we go. Make sure you go around the toothpick and back down through the empty hole. So now I've sewn my X one time, but because my thread has been doubled over, it's like I've sewn it 4 times. So again, I would do one more complete X, and then we'll make our shank. All right, so now we've made 2 X's. We're going to take the toothpick and we're going to slide it out. You can see that the thread's kind of puffy, so pull your button up against the thread, and it looks really loose right now, but we're going to tighten it up with a thread shank. So to make the shank, we're going to take the needle, and this time we're going to come up between the button and the fabric, right behind it. Don't go through the buttonhole, come right behind the button and pull it to the top side. So now my thread's underneath my button on the right side. I'm going to settle my thread and wrap it tight 3 times under the button. 1, 2, 3. So what that does is it strengthens the button, but you can also see how it kind of pops it up off the fabric. So we're almost done. We just got to tie the knot. We're going to take the needle and go between the button and the fabric right through that thread shank that we just made. So we're going to take it all the way through. But before we pull it all the way through, go through this loop that's left behind with your thread and tie a knot underneath, really tight. Now we don't want to just cut it off right here though, because then the knot will come undone and our button might fall off. So we're going to do a little trick, and we're going to hide the tail of this thread inside our thread pouch where we can't see it. So very carefully take the needle next to the shank and gently pick up 1 layer of fabric on your pouch. So you can see that the needle is through the fabric here, but if we look to the inside, we can't see that needle anywhere. It's because it's between these 2 layers. So now I can pull the thread all the way through the middle of that pouch and cut the tail way down here away from the button. And now the button will not, the knot on the button won't come undone. The last thing you got to check is to make sure that the buttonhole goes around the button and that everything is centered and not gathered. So I'm going to take the top of my pouch, I'm going to fold it over, and look at that. Now the button is on, centered with my buttonhole. So now we're going to use this pouch to hold our thread and our bobbin. We're going to just place it right in there, and this will keep it from getting unthreaded and unwound inside your bin while we are doing the sewing unit.